Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive blind spot in standard skincare and medical education, one that's been hiding in plain sight for decades. We are going to explore the incredibly complex and honestly often overlooked relationship between beauty education and melanin-rich skin. If you've ever wondered why standard dermatology and aesthetics protocols sometimes seem to just fall short for people of color, well, you're going to find this absolutely fascinating. Let's get right into it.
Picture this. You're sitting in your very own treatment room. You open up a state board-approved beauty textbook, and you find your own skin described merely as a problematic case. That was the exact shocking realization experienced by author and esthetician Judith Pluviose. Just imagine trying to learn how to care for your own skin, only for the official, mandated curriculum to tell you that your very biology is essentially just a complication. As she points out, it wasn't just a poor choice of words by the publisher, it felt like a profound erasure.
And that profound sense of erasure is exactly what led to our source material today, a book called The Skin They Forgot to Teach. In this really critical examination, Pluviose challenges the pseudoscience shaping clinical practice, education, and product development in the beauty industry. The book reveals how standard aesthetics and dermatology curricula treat melanin-rich skin not as a normal biological baseline, but as this weird exception that needs to be constantly managed. So, where does this all start? Well, the root of the problem begins with how practitioners are actually taught. You have strict curriculum mandates emphasizing things like focus on passing the state board or stick rigidly to the textbook. Now, that sounds practical, right? But consider the educational reality this actually produces. It prioritizes strict memorization over mastery, and it actively discourages asking questions. When education prioritizes a standardized exam over true biological comprehension, it pumps out technicians who just replicate steps, rather than practitioners who genuinely understand the complex biology of the actual human being sitting in their chair. But here's the really wild part. This textbook flaw, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It represents a much larger, systemic issue that the author calls the architecture of exclusion. Being invisible in these textbooks isn't just some innocent oversight or accident, it's a structural outcome. The curriculum is echoing a long history of medical texts that have pathologized or just completely ignored diverse bodies altogether. And you can see this built directly into the everyday terminology used in classrooms right now. For example, have you ever heard the term ethnic skin? In the beauty industry, it's thrown around all the time as a sort of categorical umbrella. But when a textbook labels darker skin as a special consideration, it's quietly establishing a hierarchy. It preserves whiteness as the universal baseline, the default human setting, and labels literally everything else as a variation or a deviation. It completely avoids physiological specificity and just lumps incredible, complex human diversity into a single other category. Which brings us to another highly common industry phrase, difficult to treat. When a patient's biological responses don't magically align with protocols that were exclusively calibrated for lighter skin profiles, the industry doesn't question its protocol. Instead, it frames the patient's biology as the problem. This phrase essentially acts as a defensive mechanism. It protects a flawed, limited framework from any real scrutiny. The truth is, the skin isn't difficult, the training is just incomplete. This exclusion even leaks into how professionalism itself is judged. Professionalism is frequently weaponized in these spaces to enforce cultural conformity rather than actual biological sanitation. For example, the author notes that protective hairstyles like head wraps, which are completely hygienic and actually protect clients during close contact services, are often deemed too ghetto or inappropriate for upscale clinics. Meanwhile, white students with messy buns are simply told, hey, just pull it back a bit tighter. It goes to show that the visual standards of the industry are often calibrated to erase cultural identity under the guise of cleanliness. Now, we really cannot discuss this without acknowledging the historical root of medical mistrust. These modern educational biases didn't just appear out of thin air. They are deeply connected to a long, documented history of medical exploitation. Things like the Tuskegee syphilis study or the unauthorized use of Henrietta Lacks's cells. When modern textbooks barely cover pigment biology, it's just a continuation of a very old idea about whose bodies matter most. And this history is exactly why deep-seated distrust still exists in medical settings for so many Black and brown patients today.
And if you want proof that this is a structural issue, the hard data on global beauty spending is absolutely mind-blowing. We have $67.2 billion allocated to anti-aging. Another $8.6 billion is poured into skin lightening. But research on melanated skin conditions? It sits at a staggering $0.5 billion. This disparity proves that the neglect of melanin is not due to it being biologically rare. It is systemic neglect. Simply put, the industry funds what it values.
Let that sink in for a second. $500 million globally. That is an incredibly low amount of money dedicated to understanding the foundational biology of skin conditions for a massive portion of the global population. When tens of billions are spent on correcting aging or trying to lighten skin, but practically pennies are spent on understanding melanated skin, the priority of the industry is crystal clear.
But let's pivot for a moment, because the source material doesn't just agitate the problem, it re-educates us on the biological truth. Melanin is not a liability. It is a multifunctional biological system. Describing melanin merely as a cosmetic feature or a risk factor is honestly like describing the human immune system solely as inflammation. It completely ignores its incredible, intelligent purpose. In reality, melanin is an active, highly responsive, and adaptive ecosystem. It is not just sitting there passively determining your skin color, it is actively working around the clock to protect and regulate your skin on a cellular level.
Let's rapid fire through what it actually does, because it's amazing. First up, photoprotection. It absorbs and scatters UV radiation. Second, DNA preservation. It literally forms a tiny protective cap over your cell nuclei. Third, oxidative defense. It acts as a free radical scavenger to protect your cells from damage. And fourth, it actually modulates your inflammatory response. It is a highly advanced, built-in defense system which completely debunks the tired textbook myth that it's just a complication to be controlled.
So, if it's this brilliant system, why on earth aren't students taught this? Well, it's because current aesthetics education relies heavily on a fear-based model rather than true biological understanding. Students are heavily trained on what to fear and avoid regarding melanin-rich skin, like delayed responses and pigmentation risks, but they are almost never taught the mechanisms of why it happens or how to accurately assess it. Caution completely replaces actual understanding. And look, when you only know what to avoid, you cannot provide comprehensive care.
And this has very real, very dangerous practical implications. Think about inflammation, for example. Standard textbooks teach practitioners to look for erythema, which is bright redness. But on dark skin, redness often doesn't show up that way at all. If a practitioner isn't trained to look for other signs, like swelling, warmth, scaling, or subtle changes in texture, they will completely miss the inflammation. This leads to severe misdiagnosis, undertreatment, or even applying harsh chemicals to already compromised skin, all because they literally couldn't read the signs.
Okay, so how do we actually fix this? The source outlines some very clear steps for structural solutions. First off, it is not enough to just slap a single ethnic skin sidebar into Chapter 4 of a textbook. We have to fundamentally update medical education so all skin tones are part of the core curriculum. We need deeply funded studies on pigment biology and wound healing across diverse bodies. And most importantly, training programs have got to teach future doctors and estheticians to proactively recognize and address their own clinical blind spots.
But until those big systemic changes actually happen, practitioners have to step up. They must proactively seek out inclusive resources, robust clinical image databases like Visual DX, and lean on organizations like the Skin of Color Society. You basically have to step outside the standard textbook to fill in the dangerous gaps it leaves behind. Right now, it's the only way to ensure truly equitable and safe practice. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to think about. Is safety in skincare truly universal, or is it just calibrated for one specific biological profile? When a standard is developed around a single population, calling everything else a deviation isn't science, it is conformity masked as science. So the next time you look at a skincare product or a clinic protocol, ask yourself who it was actually tested on and who it was really designed to protect. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.